the Bible is massive. Okay, so look at it. It's the biggest book you're ever going to read. To most people, we're going to get on the questions in a sec, but I just want you to kind of help us understand accessing the Bible is a bit like accessing the internet without a search engine, right? The thing's huge. Could you just in 30 seconds give us a bird's eye view of the entire Bible?
No, I thought the other question was harder, so your questions keep getting harder. So I can't, well, I can and I can't. So I'd say essentially the framework of the Bible is to think of it as 4 chapters of a story, 4 chapters of a book. The first chapter, of course, is there at the very beginning, Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it starts with creation. There was a time when the universe was not. And then the question is, well, where did it come from? And the Bible's answer is everything that exists because of the triune God. God is the creator who has made this world. And he has made human beings to flourish in this world. And in a sense, we bear his image as rational, conscious, and moral agents within the world who are made by God and for relationship with God. So that's the first 2 chapters of the Bible, which is chapter 1 of my story of the Bible, if you like, is creation. And then chapter 2 is how we've ended up where we are, which is that this world is not the world that God designed or made it to be, but this world is a world that has gone wrong. And I think our very first question that we're going to come to in just a moment is a question about suffering, which to me just is a statement that we recognize of, hang on a minute, this world isn't as it should be in some sense. So chapter 1 is God made it a good world. He made us as human beings to bear his image, to flourish in the world that he made under his rule, in relationship with him. But the problem was that we turned our backs on God and on each other. And we said, rather than let God be God in the world, we as individuals will decide for ourselves what is right and wrong. And we as individuals will decide for ourselves what human flourishing looks like. And if other human beings get in the way of what I think flourishing looks like, well, that puts us on a collision course with them, and it puts us on a collision course with God. And we've been fighting God and fighting each other ever since. So that's chapter 2, the world in rebellion against God. And chapter 3 of the Bible, which is most of it, you'll be pleased to hear, is really the story of God's solution. But actually, God has not left us in this mess. But as we heard just a moment or two ago, the story of Easter is a story about God who has come into the world to begin to put things right. So Jesus comes to restore us to a right relationship with God. And that is that is how a Christian understands themselves, not because we're good people, but as a gift of God, we've been brought back into a loving relationship with the God who has made us. And that relationship begins now and goes on for eternity. So Jesus, through his death and resurrection, has begun the process of putting a broken world right. But of course, it doesn't look a lot like that today. So we need the 4th chapter, and the 4th chapter is of new creation. So we've gone from a creation to what the Bible or theologians call a fall, which is humans rebelling against God and against each other, to some form of rescue that Jesus came to bring to restore us to God. And then finally, what we need is Jesus' return. And the point of Jesus' return, which you may have read a book or even heard the word Revelation, the book of Revelation, the last book in the whole Bible, begins to describe what it will be like when God makes all things new. And that there will no longer be sin or suffering or sickness or death. And we have that beautiful picture of where God says he will wipe away every tear from our eye. So when we think, as we will in a moment, about what's gone wrong with the world, the Christians will set it in that 4-chapter story of creation, of fall, of God's rescue, and then restoration to come. That wasn't 30 seconds.
That wasn't 30 seconds, that was helpful. We're going to have to pick things up a little bit, but essentially, this is what God's revealed to us. So the pushback inevitably has to be from the questions, show me where you found that in the Bible, right? It's kind of set fire to the Bible rather than burn your house down kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, ideally don't do either of those things, but essentially what we're saying is that as Christians, our authority is the Bible. It's not us. So where, if in any shape, way, or form, someone can show me that my way of thinking and reasoning is not in accordance with what God has said, then it's me that needs to change, not the book. So yeah, we believe in Revelation that God is God was spoken, and therefore that my life and thinking needs to be brought into line with it.
Thanks, yes. Okay, so rolling into the first one. So if you have the next slide, it's going to list all three. The first one that was selected last night was God allow innocent people to suffer.
Well, can I just say, I think my purpose tonight is not to answer these questions, because if I could give you a 2-minute answer to that question, you ought to be deeply concerned, because it's far, far, far too big for that. But what I'm trying to do is point you in the direction of how a Christian begins to understand and answer these questions, so that you can go away and think about these things some more. So my job is not to answer to your satisfaction or mine, I think, any questions that are this big, if I'm being given 2 minutes to do it. What I hope to do is give you a sense of how a Christian approaches this question that might lead you to say, okay, well, I can think a bit more about that, because that's interesting, curious. I disagree for this reason or that reason, and we can sort of carry on the conversation. I said a moment or two ago that I think this is, it is for some of us a deeply personal question. I'm talking to a friend at the moment. His wife has breast cancer. She's going through chemo. She's not doing well with the chemo. You know, he and I are exchanging WhatsApps every week. I'm going to go and preach for him at his church next Sunday. You know, he and his wife are really going through a lot. It's a very, very personal question to them. It might be to you. Or right now, it might be more of an academic question, which is just, well, I put on the news, and I see what's going on, and I just can't see where God is in all of this mess. So I don't know which angle you're coming from on this one, but I think the reality is, whoever we are, it seems to me everyone I meet says we need to fix this broken world. So you could go the John Lennon kind of imagine approach, which is where you want to push religion out altogether because you see it as part of the problem. Or you might try to answer it from a deeply Christian perspective, where you're going to say, actually, it needs God to come and fix a broken world. But that's what I like about this question, is that it seems to me we're each of us saying there's a problem here. And I want to say to you, that's not altogether obvious that we should think of something as a problem, depending on our worldview. So Richard Dawkins is interesting. He's now calling himself a cultural Christian. He goes to church sometimes. A friend of mine bumped into him at a carol service at Christmas, which is a curious thing. But he does say, look, from my perspective, when you take God out of the picture, it does change the way you look at everything. So this is what he once wrote. He said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Did you notice in the middle of Dawkins' worldview as he articulated it there? No evil, no good. And for me, that sort of perspective on the world is a scary one, because we're here saying, if this is a question for us, we're saying, no, this is a problem, that there is evil, and evil is a reality, and we as human beings ought to address that and recognize that and respond to it. Dawkins is saying, no, the universe just is. It just is what it is. And some people are going to get lucky, and some people are not. Some people are going to get away with murder. Some people are going to die of bone cancer aged 9 years of age. And it just is. And you just have to take it as that. But I think we can't. And the Bible tells us, as I just suggested a moment or two ago, that we recognize the problem because this was not the world that God created. The world we live in now was not the world that God created. That's chapter 1 of the Bible, everything that God made was good. And the world that we live in is not the world that one day will be brought about by God. So we hope for a perfectly restored world. So it can't be as it is if we recognize the world once upon a time was good. In other words, it hasn't always been this way. And we can't settle for what it is if we believe that one day God is going to put everything right. So knowing that all is not well is actually the beginnings of, I think, a journey that has led many people to God. This world is not as it should be. And that's a problem for me. And maybe we need God to start to put things right. Which brings us back to the argument, which is, why would God allow suffering to happen? Well, if we are in a world that's in deep rebellion against him, and we're fighting not only him but one another, if our world is broken, then we will experience the reality of that pain and suffering as we damage each other and as we live in a messed up and broken world. But God can use that suffering and that pain to actually bring us to new desires where we start to hope for the world that he will one day make. So I have a friend, he's died now, but he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And he said to me in a phone call one time, he said, this is going to sound very, very weird, but cancer is one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And I was like, whoa, that is really? He said, yeah, because it's helped me to understand that this world is not my home, that this can't be all that there is, and that my hope is not for a happy life now, but for a new world that God will one day make, that I will share with him. So in other words, the hope of heaven, you might say, to use a Christian language, the hope of heaven began to grow in him more and more, because he realized that his time in this world was coming towards an end. So God uses suffering to wake us up in that sense, the fact that this is not our home, this is not the world as it should be. So C.S. Lewis he was an atheist, became a Christian at around the age of 30. He famously said, we can ignore pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Thanks, Neil. That was really sort of insightful. I think I want to try and link into the next question from that, going, obviously with the first question, we're saying as human beings, we identify that there is something just so wrong with suffering, and that's how it's meant to be. This idea of justice that I feel is feeding into the next question, which says, do you believe people who've never heard of Jesus go to hell? It feels quite unjust that someone might not have had the chance to read the Bible, to go to church, to hear anything about Jesus, and yet knows the exclusive claims of Jesus. He's the only way, to new life. How would you go about sort of, thoughts on that? It doesn't quite feel just.
Yeah, again, that's a huge question. And it comes of most of my family are not Christians and never have been. Didn't come from a particularly devout Christian family or home or anything like that. So I wrestle with this question of, what would it be like for them to meet their Creator one day? Let alone people from far-flung corners of the world who maybe never heard of Christianity or read a Bible or had that opportunity. So this is a personal issue for me in one sense. And I keep having to say to myself a couple of things just to settle me in one sense. And the first one is, do I believe that we need justice in this world? And the answer I, of course, keep coming back to is saying yes. Every wrong must be righted in some form or another. So again, the alternative, Dawkins, I don't want to caricature him, but I want to recognize the reality of what sits behind those words. No evil, no good. Because you could also therefore add to that, therefore no justice. So can I believe that actually some people get lucky in the sense that they get away with horrific crimes? Hitler's willing executioners in Auschwitz, some of whom never got caught. Will they face any judgment for that? And I kind of believe and have to believe as a Christian that there is a God who will right every wrong, finally. So there has to be justice, I think. And our hearts cry out for justice. And we won't get it in this world, some of us. So I think my heart says, Yes, that God is a God who will one day bring judgment. And the second one is, do I believe that God, as I know him and as revealed in the Bible, that God will only do that which is right? In other words, he's not a moral monster. He's not a vengeful being. He wants to not only do justice, but see that justice is done and done in the right way. And again, I have to say, look, there's lots I don't understand about what that judgment day will be like for some people, but I believe he's just, and his justice will be seen to be just, because God has revealed himself as a moral being, a God who is holy and a God who is loving. So hell does mean for some, finally, separation from God and all that is good. That is what hell is. It's separation from God and all that is good. And so when Jesus said on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is Jesus saying, I am going through hell on this cross. God forsaken us. The wrath of God being poured out on Jesus on that cross. And what that shows me is that Jesus, who said that he came into the world to save sinners, was willing to go through hell on that cross so that you and I might not have to experience that for ourselves. So God is not only a God of justice who will see that judgment is done, but God is a God who's willing to bear that penalty upon himself on the cross so that we might not have to. So that literally the man who was crucified alongside Jesus, that thief on the cross, said to Jesus, as he lay dying in agony alongside Jesus, he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to that man, who was no doubt a scoundrel and a thief and a rotter who'd done nothing good in his life, he said to that man, today you will be with me in paradise. So Jesus went through hell on the cross so that people who simply seek their forgiveness through him, that they may experience that forgiveness and see their eternity change forever from hell to heaven. So for those of us who have heard of the name of Jesus, for those of us who have a Bible that we can read for ourselves, ultimately, whether or not we go to heaven or hell is in our hands. We can either say yes to God and that offer forgiveness or no. So for those of us who've heard about Jesus, the responsibility kind of falls back on us in a big way, because we're not going to be able to say to God on the last day, oh, I had no idea you were God. Jesus, who was Jesus? Why? Do you see what I mean? So I think that's why we need to take these evenings and these questions really seriously. There's a lot at stake. For those who haven't heard of Jesus, and that of course over human history will be many people, I think ultimately we don't know and can't know what Judgment Day will look like for them. So for example, if someone just cried out in an Amazonian rainforest, God have mercy on me, because I know that I have failed to live up to my own standards, let alone the standards of the God who has made me. Will that be enough to save them? If they've never had a chance to hear Jesus, but they simply say, have mercy, will that be enough? You know, I don't know. And Christians actually wrestle with that question a lot. The way in which we can be sure that someone will cross from hell to heaven is if they have a chance to hear and respond to Jesus, which is why we go around the world talking to people about Jesus, because that's when we can be sure. But there'll be lots of people who will meet Jesus as their judge. And we know that Jesus will only judge them rightly. And we know that the only way in which we can cross from hell to heaven is if we seek that forgiveness. If someone's not heard of Jesus and cries out to the God who has made them to have mercy on them, have they put their faith in Jesus? Some Christians think that they didn't know him by name, but that's the effect. They were seeking forgiveness from the God who made them. And maybe that's enough. We don't know. But that's not our situation tonight. We are those who've heard and can respond.
Just one very quick thing along those lines. You're saying, is it literally enough to cry out for mercy to God and he will give it to you? The guy being crucified next to Jesus didn't have a lot of time left to do a load of good deeds and clean out his act and everything. And yet Jesus guarantees that he'll be with him in paradise. Can you just say a few words on, like, is it literally just enough to cry out to God and ask for mercy versus having to work at it?
Again, look, So the short answer is that story must tell me that that is the case. Here is a man who can do nothing for himself. So if I'm talking to little children, I sometimes say, look, religion says it's about what you do. So there are all sorts of religions in the world which are basically clean up your act in one form or another. And there'll be a scales, a weighing scales. All your good deeds and all your bad deeds will be weighed on the last day. And if you've done more good than bad, you'll be okay. That's not Christianity. Christianity is not about, here is what you must do to earn favor with God. Christianity is the opposite of that. It's the antidote to religion in a sense, because Christianity says it's not about what you do, D-O. It's about what Jesus has done, D-O-N-E. So that thief on the cross had no ability to shape his future in any other way than to cry out for mercy, and he received it immediately. And Jesus said, today you'll be with me now in paradise. Having said that, part two of my answer, which is, well, if I'm not on a cross, if I'm just here tonight, and if I were to put my seek Jesus' forgiveness, what would that mean for me? Well, the call is now to come and follow him. And so a Christian is someone who's not really got like a monopoly get out of jail card for free and just puts it in their back pocket and carries on living as they always have. A Christian is someone who has sought forgiveness from Jesus Christ and then actually committed their lives to following him. They start saying, well, you gave your life for me. I'm going to give my life back to you in return. So everyone here who's a Christian tonight says, I'm not trying to save myself in some way, but I am trying to live as someone who loves Jesus and follows him.
Okay, but that makes answering the last question quite difficult. So if people are trying to live for Jesus, the third question has got a sting about why has the church often failed to confront abuse, racism, or justice? And you've got to say that lots of times in the news, when the church is in the news, it's not for a good reason, right? What would kind of really be going on there? It's sad to see a lot of things that are reported on now.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And again, I'm aware that some of us, we may feel ourselves to have been hurt in the past by the behavior of those who call themselves Christians. Gandhi said, I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians aren't so unlike your Christ. So that's a stinging rebuke to the church from the mouth of Gandhi. And I kind of know what he means sometimes. Basically, a Christian is someone who has not only been brought back into a relationship with God by Christ, but someone who now wants to be increasingly conformed to the likeness of Christ. And so someone who says they're a Christian but makes no attempt to in any way live for Jesus, I think Jesus would say you're a hypocrite and you're a fool and you're not really one of my disciples. In fact, Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commands. So if a Christian is someone who loves Jesus, you should be able to watch their life, watch their words, and at least get a sense of this is someone who genuinely, although they will fail, authentically seeks to live for Jesus. And we know that many people around the world can put on the clothes or the robes of religion in one form or another, and actually do that out of extremely arrogant, self-centered, self-righteous ways in which their lives look nothing like the life of Jesus. And I think Jesus would want nothing to do with them. So I think if you're not a Christian here this evening, you have every right to call the church to account and to say, look, are you someone who is genuinely trying to live for Jesus Christ? You won't do it perfectly. I understand that. No one does in this broken world. We're still sinners as Christians saved by grace. But you have every right to call out a Christian who isn't seeking to do that. So when Jesus, just in the week before he died, turned over the tables in the temple, that was an act of righteous anger where Jesus turned the moneylenders' temples because they turned the house of God into a place of business. He did that as a stinging rebuke to people of religion. So Jesus actually, his greatest enemies were religious people who were trying to be proud and self-righteous. But the church must be people who reflect the image of Christ. And when they do, I think the world sees that too. So whether it's Martin Luther King, or whether it's William Wilberforce, or whether it's Christians in small ways and big ways trying to love as Jesus loved and serve as Jesus served, I think the world will see that too. but we ask your forgiveness where the church has failed. Those who are Christians love as Jesus loved.
Thanks, Neil. We're gonna have to speed things up a little bit to get through some of the Slido questions. The bar's still open. If anyone needs another drink, there might still be some food, but we're going to go a little bit quicker through the ones that you've now asked, in the hope that if you ask one in it at the bottom, we're going to try to cover all of them. So yeah, feel free. If you need to get up and grab another drink or grab some more food, I think we're just going to keep going at it and see where we get to. Is that right with you now?
Yeah.
Great. So if I just refresh.
I knew those 3 questions, and Rob and I agreed we could slightly longer answers. I have no idea now what's on these 2.
Yes, sir. Okay, so what's coming at the top is, these are all anonymous, so we don't know who's asked them. But the question says, if God loves everyone the way he made them, why doesn't he like them being gay?
Okay, and you want an even shorter answer than the other answers to these things. So remember our 4-chapter Bible. Chapter 1 is creation, which is when God made everything, including human beings, he made them good, and bearing his image perfectly. As a result of the fall, the brokenness of the world is experienced by people in all sorts of small ways and big ways, some as voluntary choices, some as involuntary choices. Sam, who's a good friend of mine, who's himself a gay Christian, in the sense of, he would say that his whole life has been same-sex attracted. He's a minister in a church. He also understands that God's design for human relationships is between a man and a woman, as set out there in those foundational chapters of the Bible in the story of Adam and Eve. And he recognizes that that will never be his experience in this world. So he has said to me, I'm content to understand that actually we all experience the brokenness of life differently. For me, I'm same-sex attracted, but I know that God's design for human flourishing was that marriage is between a man and a woman and the children that are born through that union. And so for me, being Christian means I'm choosing a celibate life. So he's saying, I'll never have sex in my life. And that's my choice to honor Jesus in my experience of life in this world. And he says some days are great days, other days are really painful days, but I love Jesus. And he also knows 2 other things that I think are just helpful to him. Number 1 is that Jesus himself never had sex. Jesus was a celibate man for his whole life. So the Lord whom he serves was someone who was not defined by sex or sexuality or having a family and kids and everything else. And Sam says, well, in that sense, I'm more like Jesus in some sense than my friends who are married with families, because he was a celibate man. The Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the letters in the New Testament, was also not married as far as we're aware. And so he himself talks and advises Christians as a celibate man. The other reality, of course, is that when the new creation comes about, when Jesus finally returns, there will no longer be human marriage. So sexuality won't feature within the new creation. It will be fulfilled, in some sense, in our perfect, intimate relationship that we'll enjoy with God. So Sam says, well, look, we're all going to be celibate for a million times a million years in heaven. So I could live at it for 50 years on earth if I'm choosing to love Jesus. Jesus chose that life. I'm going to live that life. We're all going to one day live that life, when actually sexual relationships will give way to relationships of intimacy with God who made us.
Thanks, that's helpful. But I guess you can expand that further and say it's not just sexual desires that Christians say, I'm not going to choose to follow that desire. It could be anything. It's just sort of saying that choice, that the recognition that you might have an internal desire and you're choosing not to follow it. Whereas that's the opposite of what our world's saying follow, look deep inside you and follow where that's coming from.
Absolutely. I think what Sam would say is, though, that your sexuality is not something that you choose. So therefore, there are involuntary desires, he would say, I'm leaning this way, this is who I am in this world. So that makes it harder for me than as someone who has desires that, in one sense, they've formed for themselves, such as, to chase after money and worldly ambition or whatever, that kind of thing.
Thanks. Okay, linking it with this theme of justice that we've sort of had running throughout. Well, next question says, how can we believe in a God that lets people who've never done anything wrong die, such as babies and people in the Holocaust? That kind of idea that certainly with a baby, you can't really, hold judgment over them, right? Because they're too young to have done anything wrong, and yet they die without hearing about Jesus. Can we get anywhere close to answer that might do justice for that?
Well, I'd invite you to come back to one or two of the stories that we're going to be hearing in a couple of weeks' time, because one man will tell the story of watching his teenage daughter die before his eyes on a plane flight because she went into an anaphylactic shock that they couldn't treat. So if you're wrestling with how could God allow that? He was an atheist at the time. He just watched his daughter's life go before his eyes on the plane at 14. Come and hear his story, because he's going to tell you how that worked out for him. No one would ever wish that, would they, anybody? But yet God redeemed that story in a way that he's willing to drive you that way and come and tell you. What's the date? That day, but coming up the 12th. If this is a real issue for you, it's a personal one for me. My sister was still born. My mother took many years to really be able to talk about it and come to terms with it. Pains that runs deep. The theological answer is that as a result of human beings rebelling against God, God said, you cannot live in this world. If fallen humanity lived forever, eternally, if Hitler could never be killed, and you get the idea, if evil could run unabated and unchecked, the world would be doomed. So in one sense, death falls on every human being. From dust you came, to dust you should return, is God's judgment on humans in rebellion against him. The challenge is everyone experiences mortality differently. The ultimate statistic is every one of us is going to die. So we will all experience that same reality. As fallen human beings, we will go through that death. Whether it's the thief on the cross, whether you die at the age of 100 with all of your children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren around you, having lived a very satisfying, fulfilling life. The reality is we don't understand why some people seem to get dealt a really crappy hand in life, and some people get all of the fun in life that could be going to them. There are some things that are ultimately only known to God, and it comes back to the reality of, can I trust him with my life and my future? And the story of people who've gone through some horrendous experiences, like the man who's going to come and tell us his story in a couple of weeks, is I can trust God with that story in that situation.
But that's helpful, which might link into the next one. You've given us some reasons to trust that the God in the Bible is a good God to put your trust in. The next question says, which belief is the correct one? Which belief is the correct one? Which God is real? Why do we assume that our God is the real one and only one? I'm guessing maybe this is saying, there's a lot of religions in the world. There's a lot of gods to choose from. How can we be so confident that our God, who you're describing, who's revealed in the Bible, is the one we should be putting our trust in?
Yeah, again, such a big question. I don't cause any offense to people of other faiths. But essentially, I want to say it's what one legal historian described as the scandal of historical particularity, which is, again, a boffin-like phrase that passes most of us by. What he meant was that in no other religious worldview do you have the idea that God enters into the world in flesh. That's what he meant by this scandal of historic. There was a time when God was up there, and then God came in. God came down. That is the story of Christmas. And then God came back to life. That is the story of Easter. And there are many people across many centuries who wrestle with, can I really believe that God has come into this world? And I invite you and encourage you to read the history for yourself and the accounts that we have in the Bible, as well as any number of credible authors who as second-hand sources have written as historians, as theologians, as lawyers, on this question of, can we really believe that Jesus died? Can we really believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? So that's what marks out Christianity as unique. All other worldviews might have prophets, might have books, may have philosophies, may have religious phenomena and experiences, but there is nothing like Christianity of God himself stepping into our world, living, speaking, dying, rising again. And that's what separates and differentiates Christianity.
And that's a massive claim, right? You're effectively saying if we were doing this 2,000 years ago, the creator of the universe could be sat around a table with us eating physically. That's huge.
Crazy and as big as it gets.
Okay.
But because it's a historical claim, it's a claim that you can investigate. So if someone says to me, I like to think God is like this, well, that's telling me, well, why do you think it's? Well, I had a dream, or I've been thinking about this, and I read this philosopher, and I've read that mystic, sage, and all of that has its place in conversation. Of course, it does. I don't want to sound rude or disrespectful, but it is a difference. It's thinking it all together, isn't it? To claim that God has come in the flesh, and that people actually saw him, and the miracles that he performed. They saw him crucified, dead before their eyes. He was buried in the tomb. We even know the name of the man's tomb that he was buried in. And yet 3 days later, those same disciples claim to have seen him not only risen from the dead, but to have touched his hands and eaten food with him. And then those same disciples not only said it then, but lived their lives as if it were true, and died, the majority of them, pretty horrific deaths. Crucified and killed by the authorities in the world because they saw Christianity turning the world on its own. So they saw something, they believed something, and we can investigate those claims for ourselves.
So I guess what you said is this is kind of, Christianity is really the only, faith that has this crashing together in the supernatural and the natural, so that there's bits of history recorded in the Bible which, non-Christian historians would agree with and say, yeah, that happened, right? And it's, that's kind of the most interesting thing.
So Greg Habermas is a theologian, and he says since the 1970s, he's read everything that's been written on the death and resurrection of Jesus in English, French, and German, from the 1970s through to the present day. And then he says these are the 12 facts that are undisputed facts of history, as recognized by people of all faiths and none who are seriously theologically engaged with the New Testament texts. And they're not, of course, all going to say Jesus physically rose again from the dead. But what he's saying is actually far more of the Easter events are established facts of history than we might think if we've not chosen to investigate them for themselves. And then, of course, some Christians are going to go a whole lot further and say, I think we've got good reasons to believe that he was not only crucified, died, buried in the tomb of the man called Joseph of Arimathea, but actually he not only visibly appeared to his disciples, but that his body was no longer in that grave and never has been since.
So it's pretty robust, the accounts in the Bible, which kind of links into the next question, saying, how do you know which parts of the Bible are symbolic or real? I'm guessing the idea that it's, it's like a library of books, right? And how are we to know how some might be history, there's some poetry in there. How do we kind of get an orientation and make sure that we're reading it right? I think I'm getting behind that question, particularly symbolic or real.
And that's a massive question for those of us who read the Bible as believers. We're asking those same questions ourselves. I don't know if I've ever met a Christian who thinks of the Bible as a literal historical textbook from start to finish. But the clear history books are written as history and are described to us from their very beginning as history. So just take the Gospel of Luke, which was written by a man who was a medical doctor called Luke, and he basically says, I have drawn up a researched, careful account of the life of Jesus Christ. So I'm not going to say, yes, if you're thinking, where do I even go in the Bible? How do I know what's literal and what's not? I say, well, start with the core books, if you like. Start with the books that are centered on the life of Jesus and the person of Jesus, and make no doubt at all that they are history books. They are biography, in a sense, of the life of this person of Jesus, and then say maybe meet with someone who's a Christian and have that conversation about how do we know where to draw the lines. Because I agree with you, there are some questions of is this myth? Is Genesis 1 and 2 the story of a snake in a garden and Adam and Eve? Is that a myth or a legend or literal history, or how do we decide? And those are good conversations to have, very worthwhile ones. But I would say don't allow those conversations to lead you to think, we don't know which way up to hold the Bible, and we don't know what on earth's going on, and it can mean anything to anyone. I'd say go to those core books where you know exactly what the claims are by the author and investigate them, root yourself in the history, and then from there explore the wonders and the depths of everything else that's there.
Helpful, root yourself in history, helpful. This is this is a very interesting question coming up next, sort of along the lines of suffering, but not human suffering. It's more along the lines of animal suffering. It says, why do animals suffer if God is all-loving, given that the Bible focuses on human suffering and not much on animal suffering, brackets, a deer bleeding to its death? Or I may be thinking, there's a lot of animal sacrifices described in the Bible. We've all seen animals going through pain, real pain. What's the difference between human suffering and animal suffering?
Yeah, I'm not an ethicist, a Christian theologian who's an ethicist, so this would not be an area of where I feel I can comment significantly. I think the Bible does differentiate human life from other animal life. I mean, we can all see a spectrum. We can all see that a chimpanzee or a dolphin or an elephant might grieve the death of a newborn calf. And that grief is real, and that they have memories and something that kind of is a sort of consciousness, if you like. And we can all recognize that that's a million miles away from a worker bee or an ant or something, whatever else it might be. So I think everyone's willing to recognize that. But yet when you look at the foundational chapters of the Bible, remember that first chapter, creation, which is Genesis 1 and 2, human beings uniquely bear the image of God. And so I think human beings have a unique God consciousness. We're aware of God. We're aware that this is his world. We have a sense of right and wrong. We have a moral compass, undoubtedly massively skewed by the brokenness that we experience of this world. But we can all see the UN Charter of Human Rights and say, isn't that amazing that everywhere around the world we can all sign this document? There are some very detailed claims in the UN Charter of Human Rights, and we're all signing up to it. It's almost as if it's inbuilt, hardwired into us as human beings to accept those things. And we want to say, yeah, and guess where you'll find all of those things? In the Bible. Interesting that, but that's a sidebar. So I think human life and animal life is different. Degrees of consciousness amongst animals is something I don't have any learning or any comment to make. I think I understand why some of my friends as Christian friends are vegetarians. I perfectly respect that they think we can alleviate suffering, human suffering and animal suffering if we so choose. I would only want to buy my meat from an ethical supplier, for example, because for me it really matters how those animals have been raised. So anything that's come out of factory farming, for me as a Christian, I think that is not in obedience with God's design. As human beings, we were meant to make a world in which all life could flourish. And therefore I want to recognize that farm matters and so on. But I don't have a particular view on this topic as an expert or even as somebody who's read significantly on it. But I would want to say human life and animal life are distinct to different categories, not just a scale, because we have a God consciousness, we have a moral code. It seems to me that it's right to say that only human beings will have souls that will live on forever. So in other words, when we die, that's not the end. For any human being, we have eternal souls. And that's why heaven and hell are real. But I don't think my pet, not being disrespectful again, but my pets have souls, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you. Another one coming up on the Bible. Is the Bible a reliable source? How do we know that there really is a God just by hearing about him from Bible. You've already said, you're a Bible guy, Neil. This is what we've got to go on about God revealing himself to us. How can we be so sure that that's everything?
Yeah, again, I mean, YouTube can be a nightmare to navigate the way around something like YouTube. There's a lot that we can know about the times in which Jesus lived and the claims that surround him. And so Dr. Peter Williams, who's a friend of Orlando's, for those of you who know Orlando, I know Peter not as well as Orlando does, but well enough to say hi to. And he's written one or two really good, short paperbacks on the reliability of the New Testament documents. He's a theologian at Cambridge, warden of Tyndale House, and is frighteningly intelligent, and yet can read and write in an accessible way. Dr. Peter Williams, Tyndale House, I encourage you to watch on YouTube. He's giving lectures all around the world, and he's a serious, credible Christian theologian and historian.
Thanks. We're going to go through some a little bit quicker, just because conscious we haven't got all night. Probably very briefly, how does AI fit in with Christian theology? Is using AI to write sermons or prayers ethical? That could save you a lot of time, Neil, in your day job. Would you?
Would I use it? Well, a friend of mine who writes content for the global charity of which I work for, he said, AI, it's like an over-enthusiastic research assistant. It will go away and try and find you some good answers to questions that you ask it, but you cannot and should never trust it because it doesn't know what it's doing. But it can, as a research assistant, help you to find some good content, not stories to tell, but what would be a good commentary to read on this book of the Bible, or who has written and why is he on this chapter. But no more than I want to download someone else's sermon off YouTube and preach someone else's sermon, even less would I want to rely on AI to tell me anything. But to give me some ideas to weigh out for myself, I do use it sometimes in that way. As I like my friend's description, a research assistant.
So it's more, as you said, it's more help rather than doing the job for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's wrong. A lot of the time it's just wrong. But if you know what you're doing yourself, you can use it to take some shortcuts sometimes.
Here we go. Moving back to creation, first chapters of the Bible, it says, why does there have to be a creator? Why do people assume that it's obvious that there is? Why is it so bizarre to think that the universe has always existed? Why is it so bizarre to think that the universe has always existed?
I'm not saying, I would say it was bizarre. I think you have, as best as I understand it, I'm not a scientist, you have three options. So each of us can only go down one of three routes. We either believe in an eternal universe, which many ancient Greek philosophers believed that the universe was eternal, just it's always been. So you could believe in an eternal universe, or you can believe that there was a time when the universe was not, if you take the Big Bang hypothesis. And I mean, one version of the eternal universe would, of course, be a multiverse as well. That fits within the eternal universe potentially. But if you think the universe had an origin because of Big Bang, then you're either left with thinking, well, someone or something created the universe, or you believe in a self-creating universe. So you basically got three ways that you could go. If you weren't looking at a Bible, you're just chatting in the car, what are the possible answers? You've got either an eternal universe, a self-creating universe, or an eternal God who created a universe. And those are your options. And it seems to me that you're then left saying, well, how will we even know? And I would want to say that's where science ends. Science can't give us an answer to any of those, because the universe seems to have had an origin, but maybe it's been eternally contracting and expanding, and there's been a multiverse or whatever else it might be. Forgive me if you're a scientist and I'll be getting this very wrong. But, you can't tell between those three, I don't think, unless someone brings the answer to you who knows it. So we could be in this room here tonight, locked in, and imagine we lose our consciousness in the sense of we lose our memories. We don't know where we are in the world, what this room is, we could speculate till cows come home and try and figure out what is this space, what's the other side of the walls, what can we hear, what might be there. We'd be speculating, we'd be guessing, we'd never know. What it would take is for someone to come in from outside the building, to open the door from the outside, come in and explain what on earth is going on. And that is what Christians call revelation. That is, God is not only there, but God speaks. And he speaks to us supremely through the Son. So I know how to choose between those three options, not because I know anything at all, but because I believe that someone has come into the universe and spoken to tell us what was outside, that there is a God who made this universe. So that's why I'm choosing that option rather than the eternal universe or the self-creating universe. It's revelation. It's the person of Jesus.
And what you're saying is there's a difference between the Bible and all of the other books in the library. If you have a library full of science textbooks, that's science is like observable observations on things that we can see and measure. But the Bible is kind of a different category of knowledge, would you say? It's knowledge we couldn't have if it hadn't been revealed to us by God.
That's exactly right. So that word revelation is the key to that. And, that's why at the end of the day, Dawkins says he's an agnostic, not an atheist, because he'd say, I can't tell you whether there's a God, because that goes beyond science. So technically, he says I'm an agnostic, although he's quite happy to use the word atheist, because an agnostic simply means we don't know. It's like us being in this room we don't know what's outside, but what changes everything is if someone comes in.
We've got a book for him that we're going to give out at the end. If there's any other agnostics in the room, there is a book for you. The next question is continuing sort of on the moral and ethical thread. Is self-defense for one's own life or for their family ever justified? If not, how do Christians serve in the armed forces?
That's a really good question. Well, they all are, but that's it. So, if you'd like if you want me to give you one or two things to read, if that's the question that you want to ask, I'd be delighted to do that. So give an email address to Rob or come and speak to me afterwards. Really, I do think that most Christians accept there is something called a just war theory, that actually by God's design, there are human leaders and governments, that governments are there to keep and maintain law and order. And if that government is threatened by some outside agency, whether that's a terrorist or a war started by a foreign nation, then the nation has a right to defend itself. And that just war theory can be extended in certain circumstances to the protection of my own life or the life of others. Now, there are some within the Christian community, particularly those who are Quakers, who would say it's never right. When Jesus said, turn the other cheek, that's the trump card for everything. We must always turn the other cheek. I could never pick up a gun. I could never kill someone, no matter what they were intending to do or how many people they were intending to harm. So there have always been pacifists, mostly from amongst that community, and others who, from their Christian conviction, would say, we don't think we can ever fight. And they chose not to in the First and Second World War. And that's hard for them, actually, in lots of ways. That was their Christian conviction. But most Christians do believe in what's called a just war theory, where it's appropriate as a matter of self-defense to take a life if the intention of that person is to take your life or to significantly endanger it.
Thank you. Thank you. How are we doing? There's 4 more questions on the slide here. We're still getting through these. I'm going to go with the next one. Is it free will if one choice is submit to a belief that's hard to prove, and the other choice is burning in the fiery pits of hell for the rest of eternity? I guess the choice between a belief that's hard to prove, I guess, in Jesus, that's kind of saying, or the choice of burning in the fiery pits of hell for eternity, is that really free will? Kind of. I'm trying to get behind this.
Well, time is, it's a big question. It's an important question. And I think we come back to this same point. And that's a good thing that we keep coming back to the same point, because we're not sending you off in 1,000 different directions. We're actually telling you to do one thing, which is, in a sense, to start with the person of Jesus. get. If you've not read one for a while, or if you wouldn't know how to read it, ask a Christian to read it with you and at least hear the Christian claim as set out in the Gospels. Because I think the Christian claim is that God is not hiding from anyone. God has actually come and in and through a death and resurrection revealed himself to us in a way that is undisputable. You know, the tomb is empty. It always has been empty. It always will be empty. And I don't think God is playing games with us, trying to make it difficult for us. I think it's not hard to come to the conclusion that Jesus is alive and who he is, who he claimed to be. He's not the God of philosophy. He's not the God of the mystical experience. He's the God who has lived and died and risen again from the dead. And I suppose I might dare to ask you back, what more does God need to do than that?
Thanks. I'm going to play my joker and say we're going to start wrapping things up. There's one question I think would be great to finish on. I'm not going to avoid the others. I'm going to say in a minute about what we can do about if we've still got more questions. But I think this would be a great one to finish on, Neil, that says, what is the best thing and the worst thing about being a Christian?
Well, I think that the best thing is probably to have those core essential questions of identity, meaning, purpose, and hope, to have them essentially satisfied, because my story is part of a bigger story. So, you know, there's a lot of brokenness. I meet a lot of broken people. If you're a pastor, all sorts of people come your way seeking support and help, and they've lost hope, or they don't know who they are, or they wonder what is the point of their life anymore, or they don't know why they're here, and there's a lostness, there's an aching, there's a longing to have that void filled. And if Christianity is true, it doesn't take all of your problems away, but it answers every one of those essential questions. So I wake up in the morning and don't find that my life is supernaturally better than anybody else's life. I'm going to suffer and fall ill. I'm going to forget to feed the cows. I'm going to whatever else it might be, just as much as the next man. But I know who I am. And that is a rock solid confidence that I have, that essentially I am loved by a Father in heaven. And my story is part of his story. And that gives me joy and confidence and hope in this life. And those stories that we're going to hear week after next will be stories of people who are saying a version of that for themselves. Even though this happened, even though that was my situation, I met Jesus and he has fulfilled that existential void and that need. I think that is absolutely the best thing. Probably the worst thing, well, some things, I mean, certainly where the church fails. We talked a bit about that earlier tonight, and we don't live up to our calling. Where I fail to live as Jesus called me to live, and I feel the sense of my own sin. Those are some pretty bad things. I think probably for me, one of the worst things is where no matter how much I try to persuade people that Jesus is worth it all, that I can't persuade them to do that. That includes most of my family as things stand here.
Thank you so much, Neil, for your time. You've really given you a grilling tonight. That has been a big effort, and I really appreciate you coming up from London. Can we just give Neil just a round of applause? Thanks.